Japan is a nation noted for the respect its citizens bestow on each other and visitors, where politeness, safety, and harmony are written deep into the codes of conduct. It's a country of academic excellence and high-tech efficiency, where cleanliness is indeed next to godliness. On the outside, it can make certain countries in the West look chaotic, dangerous, and downright uncivilized. So it might come as a surprise to some of you that Japan's method of executing criminals has been called barbaric and shameful, said to be a highly secret and brutally unique way of trampling over citizens' human rights. Or maybe you're not surprised. Maybe you think that is exactly why Japan is so orderly and safe. It's complicated, so we're gonna lay bare the details of this so-called barbarism and see how effective it is in today's episode of The Infographic Show. Evil design of Japan's death row is worse than death. Japan is without a doubt exceptionally unique in the way it convicts and kills its criminals, but it's not unique because it kills its criminals. In the world today, 55 countries still uphold the death penalty, although 7 of those in practice only do it for very exceptional crimes, and 24 of the 55 haven't executed anyone for 10 years or more. But some nations seemingly cannot get enough of execution. Japan, like the US, is one of the last developed democracies that still regularly carries out executions, joined by Singapore and Taiwan. Taiwan has been relatively restrained, but not Singapore. Since the 1990s, it has executed hundreds of people. For such a small country, that is an astonishingly high rate, making it one of the world's execution capitals. Unsurprisingly, most of the condemned are drug offenders, men hanged by the state for trafficking narcotics. In the past 20 years, only one woman has shared that fate, a heroin mule. So there are really only 3 highly developed countries on Earth that regularly whack their taxpayers and unwanted guests. If we forget about Singapore, we have one country that is crime central, the US, and the other that is a veritable Eden, Japan. What makes Japan so different than the US is that it's much more secretive. It doesn't tell the media when an execution is going to happen. It doesn't even tell the condemned until the very last minute, leaving them waiting in their tiny prison cell for years, not knowing if every day will be their last. As for the families, they don't get the memo until their father, brother, or uncle already fits snugly inside an urn. It's all done behind closed doors. If an execution is botched, which at some point is a statistical certainty, no one knows except a handful of suited officials. We'll look harder at the gory details later. First, let's zoom out and compare Japan's legal killing regime to the rest of the world. China leads the way by far as the world's most trigger-happy executioner, but it is so secretive, we can't be sure of the tally. Amnesty estimates over 1,000 people are executed there each year, usually by lethal injection, sometimes after a confession forced through torture, which is why global human rights organizations regularly put China on the needs improvement list. Going by the data shared with those human rights outfits, so excluding China and North Korea, globally there were 1,518 executions in 2024. It was a bumper year, up 32% from 2023, where there were just 1,153. If the world had been slacking in 23, the ever-reliable Middle East came to the rescue in 24. Iran was the outright winner, officially knocking off 975 people, including 32 women, most on murder and drugs charges. Some said to have killed a husband in the context of domestic violence. Saudi Arabia took the silver medal with a formidable 342 executions, again most of them related to drugs and murder, with what was called a record-breaking rise in the executions of foreign nationals and women, although unlike Iran, it was barely covered in the Western media. And Iraq limped home to pick up the bronze medal at just 79 executions, after what Human Rights Watch called a lot of unfair trials based on torture-tainted evidence. The US put in a valiant effort but was left in the dust, missing the podium with just 25 executions. Still, that was first place among developed democracies, ahead of Singapore, which had 8, Taiwan with 1, and Japan, which took the year off. Other big hitters included Egypt, Vietnam, Somalia, and Yemen. The vast majority of people executed in the world were men, and a staggering 42% were for drug offenses. Of the 28,025 people on death row in the world in December 2024, it is drugs and murder offenses that fill most of the list. As for global exonerations in 2024, they mostly involved killers, some of them wrongly convicted. There were 9 in total, 5 in Malaysia, 3 in the US, and 1 in Japan. The heartbreaking Japan story is coming up later in this video. Unlike the US, Japan doesn't execute people because they merely travel with bricks of high-quality heroin. It only goes after hardcore killers. Just about all of the 98 inmates executed in Japan from 2000 to 2022 could easily fit the profile of monster. They're almost always male. Since 1993, 3 women, all of them serial killers, have been executed. The last one in 2012, Sachiko Ito, was a self-confessed psychic who beat 6 people to death with large drumsticks during exceptionally rowdy exorcisms. If we look at the US in the same time frame, 2000 to 2022, it is way ahead of Japan in the statistics, executing 960 people, but it has almost 3 times the population. Still, the rate at which Japan executes murderers is similar to the US. It's just that the US has many more killers, so it has a lot more executions. The US is also much more creative than Japan, its individualistic culture shining through in the fact that some states are kind enough to offer a death menu to the soon-to-be-dead prisoner. Of those 25 Americans executed last year, all male, most were given lethal injection, but 3 were gassed. However, if you're American and one day you're fortunate enough to be given the menu, you definitely don't want to go with firing squad. If you want total efficiency and you don't like pain, we would suggest the guillotine, but it seems that's too barbaric. Maybe it is for the onlooker, but it isn't for the prisoner. Another major difference is that Japan is centralized. In the US, only 27 states have the death penalty. Another 4 have it: California, Ohio, Oregon, and Pennsylvania. But their current governors have put a hold on killing criminals. Americans in general feel differently about the death penalty than the Japanese people. In Japan, as of 2025, 83.1% of the public, according to a government survey, were in favor of it, a 2.3% increase from the year before. It's actually been popular with the Japanese public for decades, the reason for which we'll talk about in another section. But in the US, according to a 2024 Gallup poll, just 53% of people were on board with executing criminals. It was 80% in 1994, so unlike in Japan, there has been a profound shift in public perception. It seems that Gen Z and millennials are less enamored with the death penalty than Gen X, boomers, and what's left of the greatest generation. Still, it's not a huge difference, with 42 to 47% of youngsters high-fiving execution and around 60% of older folks giving it the thumbs up. Okay, so now you have seen the playing field, let's take a look at what's underneath. As we have said, Japan saves execution for the worst of the worst, the maniacs and the basement-level sexual deviants. That's how we describe Takehiro Shiraishi. In 2017, he took social media toxicity to another level when he used the Twitter platform to befriend and murder 8 women and 1 man. 3 of his victims were just high schoolers, girls that he flirted with online, and induced to meet him in real life. And that's how he became known as the Twitter Killer, which you have to admit isn't as good as the ex-maniac, or better still, the ex-executioner. Moving on, Shiraishi worked in an area called Kabukicho, one of Tokyo's neon-soaked red light districts. His job was a scout, looking for women that he could tempt with a job offer in one of the many hostess bars or brothels. He then moved to Zama in the Kanagawa prefecture. He was known on the streets as a creep, which is probably why he started hanging around cyberspace. To those people unfortunate enough to take him up on the offer to visit him at his apartment, he employed the age-old tactic of plying them with sleeping pill-infused alcohol. When they were suitably zonked, he strangled them to death and cut their bodies into pieces. Japanese apartments are notoriously small, so he was left with few options for disposal. He packed arms, heads, legs into his freezer, and he put the rest of them into coolers, which neighbors later told the police created a terrible stink. Shiraishi later admitted he had purposefully hunted for lonely people online, mostly women who were psychologically damaged. He promised them that he would do them a favor, kill them, in what was a kind of pact since he then told them he also wasn't a big fan of existence. But he had no intention of hurting himself. He used them for sexual depravity and stole their money. What is surprising is that anyone actually went to visit him. He wasn't exactly handing out deal breakers. A young lady who gave his invitation a hard pass later told the police he had given me 2 options. One was that he had made me unconscious by putting sleeping drugs in my drink and then strangling me with a rope. The other was that he strangles me with a rope from behind while I'm watching TV or something. Decisions. Anyway, he was easy to catch, given a digital paper trail that led straight back to his lair. The story shocked Japan. This was a vile human being, the scum of the earth. So for most people, he had to be killed. And not many would think about his human rights in prison or when he was hanged in the execution chamber. Still, how many of them knew what really happened when he was executed in 2025? and how many understood Japan's somewhat dark history regarding the death penalty. Another standout case of recent times was Tomohiro Kato, a man who also belongs to Japan's Monster Club. In 2008, he rented a 5-ton Isuzu truck and he drove it into a crowd of people crossing the street at a busy shopping district in Tokyo. 3 were killed immediately, and as others moaned on the ground, Kato got out of the truck with a dagger in his hand and he went on a stabbing spree. He killed another 4 and injured 8, the deceased as young as 19 and as old as 74. He later told the police it didn't matter who I'd kill. Here was a seemingly privileged young man. He'd come from a wealthy family and had enjoyed the very best education money could buy. But in his early 20s, it all went wrong. After failing to get into university, he took jobs well below his family's expectations. He was a letdown to his parents, who by all accounts were a very strict and demanding pair of people. Like any alienated, angry, frustrated young man with years of repressed bitterness to offload, Kato found his spiritual home on social media. On forums, he discovered other people who were angry like him. But he also discovered online bullies, and he didn't handle them very well. Then, when a girl he had taken a liking to cut him off and didn't reply to his emails, when he lost his crappy job, he decided the world had to pay. Just before the attack, he'd written some final words on a forum stating that he was about to go out and murder people. He wrote, "If only I had a girlfriend, I would have never become addicted to my mobile phone. I don't have a single friend and I won't in the future. I'll be ignored because I'm ugly." This spoiled brat, a former president of his elite school's tennis club, did not garner much sympathy from the Japanese public. But again, he certainly suffered at the hands of the authorities. Unlike some other crimes we'll discuss, this was a cut-and-dried case. He was guilty without a shadow of a doubt. The cops didn't need to push too hard for a confession, and a jury didn't need too much convincing. Okay, so despite these two torrid tales, Japan is a very peaceful place. Its murder rate is exceptionally low, just 0.7 per 100,000 people. That is much lower than the OECD average of 2.6, much lower than the UK's at around 1.1, and way lower than the US's 2023 number of 6.8. These numbers change depending on the source, but the fact always remains, Japan's streets are about as safe as any American yoga retreat. As you've just seen, Japan doesn't execute just anyone. In fact, for one single murder, it's almost certain you won't get the death sentence. Unlike in the US, where a particularly heinous murder, usually that of a young person, can get you the chop. But if there are multiple deaths, in Japan it's expected that prosecutors will seek the death penalty. The data shows that for a double murder, the death penalty was sought in 59% of cases. But it was 79% for more than 2 murders. The viciousness of the crime, how it affects society, and how the relatives of the victims feel are all taken into account, as is the age of the defendant, the remorse he shows, and what, if anything, is written on his rap sheet. An important factor here is the part that says how it affects society. Japan likes to keep things in order, but that can have negative consequences when it comes to justice. They have what's called a lay judge system. 9 people on a jury decide the fate of the prisoner. That jury consists of 3 judges who each get a vote, but 6 of the jury must be lay people, i.e. members of the public. And in the final vote, say it's 5 for the death penalty but 4 are against it, at least one of the 5 has to be one of the judges. This means that you could potentially have 4 people who are not even certain of the prisoner's guilt, yet 5 are. Such a system is high risk in terms of always executing the right person. What if, in Japan's hierarchical society, one of the judges persuades a few people, maybe ones who aren't very confident or don't have a high status, that the man is guilty? And it's all done in secret, so no one would know if persuasion had indeed affected the verdict. In the US, that would never fly. There, a 12-person jury must unanimously decide guilt, and in capital cases, they usually vote separately on the death penalty after a conviction. While judges typically uphold the jury's decision, they aren't bound to, and sometimes the jury itself rejects the death penalty sought by the prosecutors. And all jury members are from the public in the US, so there's no powerful judge who can sway their decision. In some cases, they can even be transparent about why they issued their verdict, unlike in Japan, where the public will never see what went into the decision-making. Different US states can have different laws, but the long and short of it is that condemning a person to death isn't easy in the US, whereas Japan has what's often referred to as a low threshold of certainty. It lays fertile ground for wrongdoing. In both countries, there are systems of appeals, but in Japan, it's much less likely that a death sentence will be overturned. It's not an exaggeration to say that it's like extracting blood from a stone, even when something is clearly rotten in the state of Tokyo. Americans on death row usually have a long time to appeal. The average is 20 years before it's time to meet the execution chamber. In Japan, the average stint on death row is between 5 and 7 years. Only about a quarter of the death row prisoners might now in Japan have been there for over 10 years. So this knocking them off quickly deal could potentially lead to profound miscarriages of justice. It's believed that 4.1% of Americans who receive the death penalty are innocent, 1 in 25. Even though since 1973, 200 Americans have been exonerated from death row, a good few innocent people were very likely telling the truth when their last words were, "You're killing an innocent man." It's believed that about 20 Americans have been murdered in wrongful executions, and that is usually cited as a very conservative estimate. Had the US been more difficult about appeals or knocked men off fast, there would definitely have been many more. But it gets worse. Japan has a history of extracting forced confessions through torture. There was the case of painter Sadamichi Hirasawa. He was arrested and sentenced to death in 1950 for a mass poisoning. He confessed, but he was tortured in the process, and he recanted as soon as he was safely away from the cops. It didn't matter, he had signed the paper, and that was all that mattered. But get this, he still spent 32 years on death row. None of the justice ministers would sign his death warrant, but neither would they retry him. He died in prison in 1987 and was never given a posthumous retrial, despite efforts by his son. Then there was Sakai Menda, the first ever and one of the very few Japanese people to be released from death row. In 1949, he received the death penalty for a double homicide he didn't commit. In a shocking case of police corruption, it was later discovered that the cops suppressed his bulletproof alibi. Menda was a poor, illiterate farmer. He was beaten and threatened and not given a lawyer, forced into signing a confession he couldn't even read. He spent 34 years in solitary confinement on death row. The jury that sent him there had no evidence to work with other than that confession. Activists later called for reform, an end to Japan's heavy reliance on confessions. They asked how many of the hundreds of executed people had been tortured into confessing, like Menda. Even so, exonerations in Japan are almost unheard of. The one we told you about that happened in 2024 was a remarkable case. The victim, Iwao Hakamata, spent almost 50 years on death row as an innocent man. This former successful professional boxer was imprisoned in 1968 after he was found guilty for the deaths of his boss and the boss's wife and 2 children. Hakamata claims the house was on fire and he bravely went in to rescue the family, only to discover 4 viciously stabbed bodies. The case shines a light on what can happen to a man in custody in Japan, since Hakamata is one of the few prisoners who got to talk about his experience. The cops interrogated him for a total of 264 hours, screaming and shouting at him sometimes for 16 hours at a time. Yet it still took them over 23 days to get him to confess, at which point he probably was a broken man. In the interrogations, they didn't even allow him to eat or go to the bathroom. And this guy was tough, a real fighting man. He later said, "I could do nothing but crouch down on the floor trying to keep from defecating. One of the interrogators put my thumb into an ink pad, drew it to a written confession record and ordered me, 'Write your name here,' while shouting at me, kicking me and wrenching my arm." We should explain something here. A confession is a powerful piece of evidence, but in many countries, especially across parts of Asia, it is disturbingly easy for police to obtain one once they have a suspect alone. In places like Japan and throughout much of the developing world, there are credible reports of confessions extracted through beatings, sleep deprivation, and other coercive methods. Human rights groups note that in face cultures, there's often pressure on police to secure quick confessions to restore social order. The result? A troubling number of scapegoats appearing in courtrooms. Before World War II, it was legal in Japan to torture a man to get a confession. The justice system later made a slight improvement when it was decided that if a confession could be used, the suspect had to tell investigators something they couldn't possibly know. The cops, under so much pressure in such a pressure cooker of a society, could still cheat the system. They could now just torture a prisoner and get him to sign a blank piece of paper, after which they could fill in the details. And with police allowed to interrogate a suspect for 23 days without a lawyer being present, well, you're just asking for trouble. Would you trust a confession made by a man who's been alone with stressed cops for 20 days when there's very little other evidence to support his confession? F no. From 1946 to 2003, 766 Japanese people were sentenced to death, and 608 were executed. But who knows how many of those people had signed that blank piece of paper? In a country where an undecided jury can write your fate, a Japanese law professor said that the police, the courts, and much of the public just want to get the case out of the way. He explained, when a death penalty is given to someone, the rest of the people heave a sigh knowing that the order of society has been restored. The question is order, when violently wrought from disorder, really order? The cops virtually had no evidence on Hakamata. First, they said that they'd found blood and gasoline on the pajamas that he was wearing when he went into the burning house. But when that didn't hold up in court, the prosecutor said some clothes that they had found dumped in the miso factory where Hakamata worked were his. They said he committed the murders, dumped the clothes, and then got changed, with some of his blood getting on the clothes. Those clothes didn't even fit him. As the saying goes, none of this would have held up in court, but that is exactly what happened. And even though almost anyone who bothered to read the details knew he was innocent, he spent decades on death row, even after several DNA tests on the blood on the clothes proved that the blood wasn't his. The Minister of Justice wouldn't let him die, but the courts wouldn't let him go. He got out in 2014 but was only acquitted last year, 56 years after he had been set up. He received $1.4 million in compensation in 2025, but at 89 he might not get to have much fun with his newfound wealth. Then again, he is Japanese, so maybe there's life in the old dog yet. Jokes aside, this man suffered more than you can imagine. Like all death row prisoners, he was sent to solitary confinement. This is unlike Western solitary. In Japan, the prison demands total silence. They spend every day in the cell, the size of a bathroom. There is no communication with other prisoners, and they're not allowed to talk to the officers. They live their years in the madness of quiet. Hakamata was barely even allowed visits. His requests for family to visit him were usually rejected. In many cases in Japan, out of shame and a sense of honor, families abandoned the condemned. But Hakamata had people who wanted to visit him. So for 30 years of his life, he was confined to a tiny cell. No TV, rarely any exercise, just him and his thoughts. After 30, they moved him out of solitary, but by that time he was already mad. He was so crazy that he had stopped writing letters. In 2009, it was reported he was suffering from institutional psychosis. But if the torment of silence isn't enough to drive you insane in Japan, death row prisoners never know when their day is coming. The government keeps the execution date a surprise. Every single day could be their last. One day, they might hear more noise than usual outside of their cell. That's the day they think they're going to die, but no, it doesn't happen. Then, one day it does. The family only finds out once the deed is done. There are no goodbyes, no final letters. They don't even give the family the ashes. The government says not knowing saves the prisoners from suffering. But men have talked about the torture of just waiting to die every single day. They want to mentally prepare. They want to get things off their chest. Many want to appeal their sentence. But not knowing causes them to live the rest of their existence on high-stress alert. Every footstep, every door clanking open or shut, they think it's their time. Once the Minister of Justice has consulted a board, he can sign the death warrant. After that, the prisoner will usually be dead within 5 days, but he will still only find out an hour or so before he is swinging at the end of a rope. On the day of the execution, never a weekend or a national holiday, the prisoner's door will be opened at about 8:30 a.m. and he'll be taken away. When they finally tell him he's about to die, he's allowed to write a will. He might be allowed to smoke and he will be given prison food, although it's uncertain if it's anything better than the usual stuff. If he's Buddhist, like most Japanese people, he'll have the chance to be given Buddhist rites. If he's Christian, he can meet with a Christian priest. Now it's 9:30 and it's time to go. Japan has a total of 7 execution chambers in various prisons. The prisoner will be taken to one of them, where he'll be led to a wall and handcuffed to hooks. When it's time, they'll cover his head with a hood and they'll walk him to the middle of the room, where there's a trapdoor built into the hardwood floor. As his head slips into the noose, there will be 3 guards in the next room. None of them will be able to see him, and in front of them are 3 switches. One of the switches will release the trapdoor, but the guards don't know which one. So none of them will have to live with the guilt of knowing they've killed someone. It's presumably a long drop hanging platform, so no doubt the length of the drop has been calculated per the prisoner's body weight, thereby ensuring the procedure doesn't decapitate him or just leave him hanging without a broken neck. Because of secrecy, it's impossible to know if Japan has botched any executions, but it likely has. In the US, out of 2,721 hanging executions, 85 have been botched, giving a botch rate of 3.12%, which is not as bad as lethal gas, 5.4%, or lethal injection at 7.2%. If you demand total efficiency, which the Japanese are known for, you should go for the firing squad, and if it were offered, the guillotine, which both have a highly respectable botch rate of 0%. According to one report, the Japanese switch pushers each receive 20,000 yen for the job, or about $180. Not bad at all for pressing a button, and they don't have to deal with the body. The dead man is now dangling in the room below. After 5 or so minutes, a doctor will confirm death. A little highlight of the ordeal, according to a retired executioner who was once a senior officer at the Osaka detention house, is that the knot on the noose is tied in a certain way, so the dead man's head is bowed as if he is showing respect to the witnesses. Those witnesses are usually officials and prosecutors, not the media or family members of the victims. It's said that when the prosecutor returns to his office, there will be salt scattered on the floor, an act of ritual purification to make him feel better. The body is then taken away to be cleaned, it'll later be cremated, and the ashes will then be the property of the state. And that's it. It's done. The family will later find out that they are one person short, and the public will be told via the media that the order in their lives has been restored. While Japanese convicted killers have truly committed vile crimes, including the 9 juveniles since 1966 who received the death sentence, the horrendous conditions they're kept in have been met with widespread criticism by global human rights organizations. The system isn't seen as punishment, but torture. Supporters of such harsh punishments argue that it deters people from committing murder, after which they might brandish Japan's excellent crime statistics. But academics in Japan argue that there's no evidence that capital punishment, and certainly not torture in confinement, does have an effect on the crime rate. It might, but it's impossible to calculate because there is nothing to compare it to. Crime rates don't neatly correlate with how harsh a country's justice system is. In fact, some of the most punitive countries like the US, the Philippines, Brazil, and Russia struggle with high levels of drug use and violent crime. Meanwhile, nations like Iceland, Denmark, Portugal, and Austria maintain low crime rates with relatively lenient justice systems and minimal policing. Portugal even decriminalized drugs. And no, society didn't go to hell. The strategy, while not by any means solving drug issues, has been a success, but it has been ignored by most of the world. Then there are the countries like China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, where crime rates are low but the justice systems are brutally repressive. In these cases, it might look like brutality guarantees safety, but it is not so cut and dried. There's a case to be made that when the system becomes more civilized, the people become more civilized. But it might depend on which culture and what kind of society we're dealing with. Statistically speaking, long sentences, torturous confinement, and the threat of death don't always equate to peace. Although it seems in Japan much of the public thinks it does. They might be right. It's hard to know. Although history shows us that flaying men's skin, gouging out their eyes, or throwing them in a river in a leather sack full of monkeys and snakes didn't necessarily mean low crime rates. It was quite the opposite. So would Japan suddenly go to hell if the government stopped torturing prisoners? It's not an easy nut to crack, so why don't you tell us how things should be in the comments? And you should watch this: what first 24 hours in Supermax prison are really like, or have a look at the most addictive drugs ranked.